Well, the recent picture of the father and daughter drowned trying to reach the United States caused anger and brought more attention to the issue of migration. But when the outrage subsides, where do we look for solutions? Welcome to Roundtable. Hello, I'm Matthew Moore. Now, from Central America to Sub-Saharan Africa, people are on the move, fleeing violence and poverty as always in the hope of a better life. And they're doing it in record numbers. So the search for lasting answers is becoming even more urgent.
From people fleeing war in East Africa to crossing the US border or the Mediterranean Sea, stories of refugees and migrants seeking safety or a better life are rarely out of the news. In 2018, the UN Refugee Agency reported its highest figure ever of 70.8 million forcibly displaced people who fled their homes due to persecution, conflict, violence and human rights violations. These figures include 25.9 million refugees, 41.3 internally displaced and 3.5 million asylum seekers. More than two-thirds of the world's refugees come from 5 countries: Syria, Afghanistan, South Sudan, Myanmar and Somalia. In many developed countries, fewer refugees are being admitted than in the past. In the US, the Trump administration has capped refugee admissions to 30,000, the lowest in US history. Unhcr argues the best solution for refugees is voluntary repatriation and resettlement in another country. Currently, 1.4 million refugees urgently need resettlement. With 25 people forced to flee every minute in 2018, how to deal with mass movements of people is an issue that isn't going away.
Well, let's introduce our guest now, and joining us on the line is Alexander Betts, Professor of Forced Migration at the University of Oxford. Here in the studio, we have Matt Saltmarsh, the Senior Communications Officer from the UN's Refugee Agency. Lucia Kula is an international human rights lawyer at SOAS, the University of London, and we have the journalist Dr. Ramzy. Baroud, thank you, and welcome all of you to Roundtable. Matt Saltmarsh, if I could start with you, as you're at the UN Refugee Agency. We heard in that report that refugee numbers are at a record level. Let's just begin with that. How did we get to a record level of refugees around the world?
Well, I think the main point is really that the world, international actors, countries, regional actors have been very, very bad at making peace in recent years. If we look, for example, at the war in Syria, that's been rumbling on since 2011. And if we look around the world at different conflicts, it's very hard to see solutions for peace coming through. I mean, we looked recently at recent conflicts and we could only find a small one in Gambia in recent years that had actually been resolved. The main ones have been ongoing, and then we have protracted situations like Afghanistan, for example, which have been on and off for decades, and that really goes back 4 decades.
So you have refugees from Afghanistan and Pakistan that have been there for generations.
Correct.
Okay, but this has always been the case. Is the world getting worse, more violent?
I think it's always been the case, and there have been significant numbers of refugees in previous decades, of course. It's just that recently we have that combination of refugees and significant numbers of internal displacement as well. And when you put the two together, the numbers have been rising in recent years.
Is there genuinely a record number of refugees, or is it that the world's population is getting bigger and naturally that would be the case?
Well, it's the highest number that we have on record since we've been charting that since the early 1950s. Alexander,
I understand you've got a qualifier for this crisis in that the number as a percentage of the world population is actually very, very small. Can you get into that for us?
I think we need to have a degree of perspective. There's a real tendency to label what's going on around the world as a displacement crisis, a refugee crisis. And that's the language we used in Europe in 2015 and 2016. But we just need some perspective. The number of refugees is around 26 million. That's just over 0.35% of the world's entire population. So globally, it should actually be a manageable challenge. We should be able to accommodate that number of refugees. The real difficulty is they're quite geographically concentrated. So 85% of the world's refugees are actually in low and middle income countries. They're not predominantly in Europe. They're not mainly in North America or Australia. They're in some of the poorest countries in the world, countries like Jordan, Lebanon, Pakistan, Iran, Uganda, Ethiopia. And those countries are hosting refugees, not because they're disproportionately generous, but because they're in bad neighborhoods. So we need to be cautious in using the language of crisis and recognize that it's a small proportion, it should be manageable with global cooperation and responsibility sharing.
Okay, we're going to get to that, whether it's manageable or not in a moment. Just about the number of refugees that you gave and the headline figure that we've heard about, just explain why there is a difference there.
Well, they're identical as far as I can tell. UNHCR's numbers say there are around 70 million displaced people around the world. That includes internally displaced people.
Yeah.
About 25 to 26 of them million are refugees who have crossed an international border because of war or persecution.
And the people who are classified as IDPs, internally displaced people, their situation is not necessarily any better than the people who have fled their own country. Is that right?
They're in a refugee-like situation, but they haven't crossed an international border. So when we have internal armed conflicts, civil wars, whether it's in the past in Colombia, the Democratic Republic of Congo, South Central Somalia, not everyone flees across a border. Some people move from a very unsafe area of their country to a more safe area and seek sanctuary. And organizations like UNHCR and other humanitarian agencies provide support to them. But they're equally in desperate situations with great humanitarian needs and need support, but we often neglect those internally displaced populations.
Thank you. Now we have two members of the panel who have personal experiences of being refugees, Lucia and also Ramzy. Lucia, if I could just start with you. Can you just give our viewers an idea of your own personal experience?
My own personal experience is very different from, let's say, those who are internally displaced. I grew up as an asylum seeker in the Netherlands, so I had...
Originally from Angola?
I'm originally from Angola.
So what was happening in Angola at that time that you felt you had to flee, or you had to flee?
Yeah, I fled Angola with my mother at the time and my younger sister, and Angola at the time had the longest running conflict in the continent. It wasn't a safe space for parents who were politically active. So fleeing to the Netherlands was the solution that they sought. So growing up as an asylum seeker in the Netherlands, I do have an experience of what it means to move across international borders and what it means to grow up.
Do you think there's a big difference compared to 1994 when you fled Angola to go to the Netherlands and where we are today? If you were to look at an equivalent asylum seeker, do you think things have improved or become worse since your day?
I think there's a significant difference. Things have definitely improved. Like, if you look at the knowledge that there is out there with regards to refugees and asylum seekers, there is more knowledge available for people. The general public knows more about what's going on in the world, and they're more receptive to people fleeing in, let's say, comparison to what happened in the 90s. I experienced 12 years of an asylum process, which would be almost impossible in this time because...
so a drawn-out period that was very difficult for you.
Exactly.
Okay, we're going to come back to that and look at today's situation in a moment. First, Ramzy, you were actually born in a refugee camp in the Gaza Strip. Just explain what the situation was like then, and if you like, you can bring us up to date with what's happening in the Palestinian territories today.
Absolutely. My experience is somewhat similar but somewhat different from Lucia in the sense that I was born and raised in the refugee camp. My family was ethnically cleansed along with 800,000 Palestinian refugees. That's 2/3 of the overall Palestinian population in 1948.
Driven out of?
Driven out of historic Palestine, later renamed Israel. But for 71 years, there is this kind of this sense of entrapment in the sense that the refugee camps are still there, the refugee status is still there. There has been absolutely not only no political solution, but no attempt at respecting international law whatsoever and putting pressure on Israel to alleviate this problem.
So this comes back to what Matt Saltmarsh is saying, which is that the political will to sort out conflicts is just not there in many cases, and your situation has been going on for decades.
Absolutely, and I agree with your guest over Skype in much of his assessment, but what I disagree with is the use of the term bad neighborhoods, in the sense that Palestine hasn't been in a bad neighborhood because of something particularly wrong about Palestine or Syria or Libya or Yemen. What we often neglect when we discuss the issue of refugees is that how war, military interventions, political meddling results in these kind of conflicts. So Australia and Britain and France and North America, they are safe, they are secure, they are in the good neighborhoods, but in actuality, it's their interventions and in what is happening in the Middle East right now that actually made them bad neighborhoods in the first place.
Alexander, you probably want to come in and just qualify your point. I'm sure you meant well.
No, I mean, the only point I meant was that the reason why 85% of the world's refugees are in low and middle income countries is often not because those host countries are disproportionately generous. It's because they neighbor countries where there is conflict or violence.
So in your situation, Ramzy, you were born into a refugee camp in Gaza. Now, a lot of people would be a bit confused about whether or not you're a refugee or an IDP or what.
Right. So basically you have 5.9 million Palestinians who are classified as refugees according to the United Nations. That's the largest refugee population anywhere in the world, and it has been the case for the last 70 years and counting. Most of those refugees are based elsewhere. But in Gaza, for example, you have 2 million Palestinians living in the besieged Gaza Strip. 1.2 million of them are people who were pushed out of their original homes in historic Palestine, whether it's Jaffa or Akko or Hebron and so forth, and they ended up being in Gaza. So they live as if they are refugees on a refugee status because that's not their original home, and there has been nothing has been done to actually restore their old status as citizens in their own country. And that's why they are caught in this very strange limbo. They are neither here nor there.
Matt, if we were to look at this as a case study, would you say it's typical of the sort of impotency of the international community to resolve these conflict situations?
Well, I think there are an increasing number of protracted refugee situations around the world. Earlier I mentioned Afghanistan, of course Palestine is a very good example, and a number of others around the world, in Africa as well. And even if we look in Central America, there's a huge population of internally displaced people in Colombia, and we now have the Venezuela situation that's adding to that. So I think there is a sense that these crises are becoming more protracted, they're becoming longer term.
Isn't that the role of the United Nations, to actually take an overview and get involved and sort things out?
That's right. I mean, the Security Council has been deadlocked on a number of conflicts around the world. But in terms of the humanitarian approach, there has been some new thinking. There are these two new initiatives called the Compacts. One is on migration and one is on refugees. And these are attempts to bring together global actors, governments, but also other members of society, other actors in society, to actually look holistically at these problems and try to bring in solutions, whether that's around funding, whether that's around return, whether that's around resettlement, or whether that's around integration and independence and solutions.
And are the benefits of those two compacts being felt at the moment, or is it too early?
I think it's too early. They were only passed or agreed at the end of last year. In terms of the Refugee Compact, we have a stock-taking meeting at the end of this year, from which we hope there will be some pledges and some movement from international actors. But I think it is too early to actually be expecting a lot from those compacts right now.
Lucia,
Can I just
yes,
add
please,
to the,
come in.
I think it's great that Matt mentioned compacts. We need to understand that the compacts are no legal provisions, so they don't have any actual legal background to it. So they're basically
they're not binding.
They're not binding.
Right.
They're basically points of conversations for governments and NGOs and other people involved with migration and refugees. And it's a great starter, but I don't think it will form any solution to the actual problem.
Would you go further? Would you say these are sort of moves by international organizations to make themselves feel better, like they're making progress, but actually on the ground very limited results?
You would almost have to say that, because I think the intention is there, but the actual acts to prevent and to solve these solutions are very lacking with regards to creating instruments that are not binding and creating dialogues that continue on without any actual solution. It doesn't actually solve the problem, but it just moves the problem to further
But can you understand the frustration of refugees who want things to move faster and they want to see some action?
I can, and I fully understand. They are non-binding, these compacts by nature. And I think if we look at the politics around the world now, the nature of politics, some of the governments that we have in place in different parts of the world, I think that is the reason why perhaps the compacts were not as forceful or as binding as some people might have expected. But given that context, I think many people in the international community feel we now have something that we can work towards, and a way of maybe sharing the burden. Back to Alex's point earlier about 85% of refugees being in developing countries, maybe doing something a bit more to help those countries that are bearing the biggest burden.
You mentioned before we started that there are essentially three scenarios. You know, when somebody who's very desperate flees their country, there are three scenarios. They can either be returned, or they can be integrated into the country of asylum, or they can be resettled, for example, into the United States or Canada or whatever it might be. What is the most common outcome for refugees?
Well, the most common outcome has been return, but unfortunately, return is very difficult. If you take a case like, for example, Syria, we, UNHCR, and most other actors do not believe that it is safe for refugees to return to Syria at this point. And unfortunately, the number of returns registered in 2018 was down somewhat on previous years. So while that is a solution, it's not working in the way that it was before, unfortunately. And that may go back to what we discussed earlier, the protracted nature of many of these conflicts. The integration solution can work, and there are some examples, particularly in Africa, where we think there is positive movement in this direction. Uganda, I think, has been a good example of that. But if you look at some other countries, for example, Lebanon, it's clearly not a solution. The government and the people of Lebanon are saying we don't want to have refugees on our territory for the long term, and they need to go home. So that's when you can get stuck in a very difficult, intractable medium-term situation.
And then resettlement, where does that tend to?
Well, unfortunately, the resettlement numbers have been diminishing. There was something of an increase around 2015, 2016 with the high water mark of the Syrian crisis.
Right.
But since
you're
then,
talking about predominantly Germany there.
Well, in terms of resettlement, European countries, Canada, the US was the biggest resettlement country. Yeah. That has now fallen, and it's been overtaken by Canada.
So it's fallen a little bit, and Canada's slightly overtaken the United States in terms of resettlement.
Reasonably substantially, but we aren't talking about huge numbers.
No,
here.
it's about 28, 30,000 or something like that?
A little bit more than that. In 2018, the numbers were around 80 or 90,000, but that was down somewhat on previous years.
Yeah. Alexander, we've taken a look at those three options that Matt has spelt out. What are your thoughts on those three scenarios?
The reality is that for most refugees, none of those scenarios are available. Return can't take place because of the absence of peace. Local integration in terms of a pathway to citizenship doesn't happen because host states are not willing to provide long-term residency. And resettlement's available to less than 2% of the world's refugees. So for most refugees, they're stuck in what are called protracted situations. They will stay in the first country of asylum, the first country they reach, for many years. The average is probably around 2 decades. They can end up being there for 5, 10, 20, even 30 years. So if we're going to think about long-term solutions, for most people, the 85% of refugees in low and middle-income countries, we have to think about something more sustainable in those first countries of asylum, in countries like Pakistan, Iran, Uganda, Ethiopia. The only way to do that is to shift from a humanitarian logic, one that provides food, clothing, and shelter, to a development logic, one that provides jobs, education, long-term prospects to both refugees and to the host community. And that's the shift in a way that the Global Refugee Compact is trying to help facilitate.
Well, that's an interesting point, Alexander, but what about citizenship?
In an ideal world, we need to ensure that refugees have a pathway to citizenship. And each of those scenarios you outlined is a route to that. But for most refugees at the moment, they're stuck in limbo. And very few countries are prepared to provide long-term citizenship. They'd rather wait for peace and security to take hold in the country of origin and push for return. And so we've got to provide something that's more gradual, more progressive. access to the things that refugees don't have today, which are usually socioeconomic rights, the right to work, freedom of movement, access to post-primary education. If we do that, they can become contributors to the host communities. It doesn't have to be the case that refugees are an inevitable burden on their host societies. They can be a benefit if they've got access to skills, training. If we tap into the potential of refugees to be contributors, then they can potentially flourish and help with the development of those countries. It's not going to work everywhere. A country like Lebanon, a tiny country, has more refugees than it can cope with. But a country like Uganda has given refugees the right to work and freedom of movement. And what we've done in our research is show that there are benefits there to refugees and to the host society and the local areas, often in border areas, that receive the predominantly largest number of those people.
Ramzy, come in.
If you don't mind me interjecting regarding the overall nature of the discussion, and it's not just in our program, but in the discussion regarding refugees throughout, the focus has been on seeing it as purely humanitarian issue, with very little political component attached to it. If you look at the case of Libya, for example, when UN Resolution 1973 passed, and it really was not by any way a call for war by any country. And it was interpreted to be a call for war. And that turned, Libya into essentially a failed state, resulting in massive migration, refugees leaving Libya, but also opening the coastline of Libya
up through sub-Saharan Africa.
Absolutely. Now, the countries that were most enthusiastic about the war, France, Britain, other NATO countries, eventually Italy, are the ones who are the ones who are most bothered by the refugees, and even...
Well, they have the most refugees coming from and via Libya, yes.
Exactly. Yes. And yet the ones who did not think about the consequences of their actions are now the ones complaining about poor, desperate refugees trying to cross.
You say they didn't think about the consequences of their actions, but if I can take you back to that period of time, Muammar Gaddafi was bombing and killing his own people in great numbers, and people were suffering. Therefore, they thought it would be a good time to come in and intercede on behalf of the opposition.
Right.
What were they supposed to do?
By no means I'm excusing neither Bashar Assad nor Muammar Gaddafi. What I'm saying that, number one, we need to deal with the whole idea of intervention in the first place. And if this intervention cannot be stopped, at least there has to be a degree of legal and moral responsibility. So at least they can offset
legal and moral responsibility. Do you want to come in, Lucia?
I agree with the guest. I think it's
so what would your outcome have been in Libya's situation, for example? Let Gaddafi continue to put down the revolutionaries and the rebels?
I don't think that's what he's saying.
Well, no, I mean, but what are your options? If you are from the Western powers that intervene, what are your options? You either leave the revolutionaries and the opposition to die in great numbers at the hands of Muammar Gaddafi, or you interfere and then depose him, and then, yes, there is resulting chaos and refugees, and many of them have gone to Europe. So what do you think would have been the better solution?
I think the criticism is mostly because the intervention is usually a military intervention, and we need to look beyond putting in military measures when the consequences are where you have a large migratory flow of people trying to leave these regions. So if we are going to intervene in a military way...
That flow from North Africa into Europe did happen in great numbers.
Yes, but if we are going to intervene in a military way, what other solutions do we have to receive these people? I think that's the most important question that we need to answer. Yes, people will flee the region, but what are we doing as EU states? What are we doing as member states to prevent people from dying while crossing
Alexander, it's interesting. I mean, it seems that the West can't do right for doing wrong. If they hadn't intervened, people would have died. People would have said they were callously letting it happen. And having intervened, they also the European Union states took refugees and migrants in great numbers. Yes, some did drown, approximately 1%, perhaps less, but they took them in. What is the solution here?
Well, I think more countries around the world are fragile, and there are more failed countries, and that's the reason why we've got more people moving and transit countries like Libya. Of course, it's right to say that the West's policies are partly complicit in those root causes, whether because of failed interventions or other areas like the arms trade. But it's not the case that countries around the world are fragile and that there's conflict just because of the West. Many societies like Venezuela, like the Democratic Republic of Congo, are fragile and weak for a whole variety of complex reasons. And insofar as it's a struggle politically or for other reasons to put those societies back together, we still have to respond to the symptoms of those underlying causes. We still have to ensure that refugees access protection, assistance, and solutions. And the best way to do that, I think, is to start with the countries that host 85%, the low and middle income countries, and ensure that they benefit through additional development assistance, and the West is sharing that responsibility, whether because they're complicit in the root causes or for other reasons, that they support citizens in local areas with large numbers of people to benefit from education, benefit from better access to health, and we enable and empower refugees to be contributors to those societies to alleviate political tensions. Of course, that by itself is not going to stop people getting on boats, availing themselves of the service of smugglers and trying to better themselves by coming to Europe or moving to North America or elsewhere. But it will reduce the number who feel the need to do that and have to do it as a last resort in order to live in safety and dignity.
Alexander, I'm afraid we've run out of time, but thank you for that. And Ramzy and Matt and Lucia, thank you all for your contributions to the Roundtable. Appreciate it. And thank you for watching. Remember, you can see more of this discussion and debate on our YouTube channel. Search for TRT World Roundtable. But for now, from me and all the team here, goodbye.